Well, you worked in 99 on the Rampart police trial.
Correct.
What was your role in that trial?
You have to understand there's police officers have a sort of a different set of rules that they're required to follow. There's a rule called lie barger. There was a suit years ago where police officers are required to respond to certain questions. If they're accused of committing a crime, they're required to respond. For example, George Floyd, he had to go in and he had to answer questions. Lie barger was accused of a crime, and his attorney, whose name it was a gentleman named Danny Davis, with whom I also worked. Danny Davis went in and said, look, just because somebody's a police officer doesn't mean they waive their Fifth Amendment privilege. So what happened as a result is there were multiple interviews. So witnesses who were police officers had to give up these lie barger statements. Those lie barger statements created what was called a dirty team and a clean team. They couldn't be mixed together. So if the prosecution was going to call a particular witness, the interview that they conducted with them as part of the clean team had to be turned over as a matter of People versus Brady versus Maryland. It's process of discovery, where the lie barger statements had to be turned over as well. So specifically with Rampart, it was an issue of going through a multitude of people who had been arrested, a multitude of police officers who were being brought into this crime, and reading all of the statements, going through the documents. There were around 600,000 documents in that trial. So it was a matter of going through and finding whatever evidence that we could find to use. I can give you all kinds of examples if you...
Well, more than 70 officers were implicated in some form of misconduct.
Right.
When it came to this case. It was the biggest documented police corruption case in U.S. history.
Yeah, and its failure cost the city, I believe, over $120 million.
Oof.
In fact, the 4 police officers combined received a settlement of close to $30 million.
Okay.
When they sued the city afterwards.
Ultimately, did anyone get convicted?
There were 3. I was not involved. There were 3 or 4 officers, I believe 3 officers, that pled out to a crime, that took plea deals.
Okay.
I was only involved in the trial of the 4, Eddie Ortiz, Paul Harper, Michael Buchanan, and Brian Liddy. That was the first trial, the big trial that took place in downtown in Judge Jackie Connor's courtroom. That's the trial I was involved in.
Okay. So who were the cops that ended up suing the city? Were any of those that you mentioned?
Yes, those 4.
The ones that pled out?
No. Again, I wasn't involved with that. The ones that pled out, they're done.
They're done.
But the 4 officers, Ortiz, Liddy, Harper, and Buchanan, filed a civil suit. Number 1, Eddie Ortiz got like 8 years in back pay. I think the other ones got some back pay because they were fired, or they either quit or the ones that were fired. Eddie Ortiz refused to quit. So he got 8 years back pay. Above and beyond that, then they sued the city for damages for false, wrongful termination and whatever else. I didn't participate in the civil thing, but I know each one of them ultimately received $5 million, with the exception, I believe, of Buchanan, because there were 2 separate trials. Buchanan was not part of the first trial, and the first trial resulted in awards to the tune of $5 million. And the second trial never took place. They just settled out, giving all 4 officers another settlement.
So ultimately, a bunch of dirty cops ended up suing the city.
Well, I'm sorry, but I disagree. So
you don't think the cops were dirty?
I think there were some questionable aspects, but again, Ray Perez, who was the sort of instigator, Ray Perez, who was the one that got arrested with this cocaine that he had stolen, that there was a gentleman named Russell Poole, who was a detective, LAPD, that alleged that this conspiracy was for the death of a police officer named Kevin Gaines. Kevin Gaines was driving Suge Knight's wife's car, Sharitha's car, got into a road rage issue with a police officer named Frank Liga, who was undercover. They ended up shooting it out. Kevin Gaines got killed. And Ray Perez stole this went into the evidence locker and was able at the time, can't do it anymore, able to access this cocaine. And that started the firestorm for Perez. So when Perez sat down, his exchange was to this DA, I think his name was Rosenberg. I can give you a bunch of dirty cops. And he started to make up things that he had done and then drag other people into it. So again, you have to believe Ray Perez. And there were just so many things that were simply not true. I mean, again, you can call them dirty cops all day, but
Perez was accused of being a member of the Bloods. He was also accused of killing Biggie at the behest of Suge Knight.
Okay.
This wasn't proven, but this is the rumors that have been floating around. And then he's also tied into David Mack somehow.
So David Mack is another LAPD officer who was accused and convicted of robbing a bank,
Right.
Bank of America. He had a girlfriend who was apparently in charge of ordering money. She ordered up, I believe it was about $740,000 to be delivered to the bank. And when the money arrived, 3 people robbed the bank. Mack got caught because the girlfriend, who was the one that ordered the money, was basically grilled, and she was convicted as well. I think she took a deal, but she rolled over on David Mack. David Mack didn't point the finger at anybody, but there were 3 people involved. One was believed to have been a gentleman named Sammy Martin. This was, again, just I don't want to say he did, but this was the rumor at the time that the belief that the Bureau was pursuing, that LAPD was pursuing, that a police officer, Sammy Martin, and Ray Perez were the other 2 with David Mack that robbed the bank. One of the issues that, in fact, I had an argument, I don't know if that's characterizing it correctly, I had a screaming match with Russ Poole on NPR radio one day when he was on making these allegations. And part of what we were trying to establish is that there was nothing to connect Kevin Gaines to Ray Perez. They had never worked together. They never, to the best of our knowledge, never knew each other. And Russ Poole took the insane attitude that, well, Ray Perez is black and Kevin Gaines is black. They're both LAPD. Therefore, they knew each other. That was literally the absurdity in which he was trying to make the nexus. So he was on NPR. I called in and we had this monster screaming match. But there's a detective, Brian Tyndall, who was in charge of the operation that I had a very good relationship with. He's now retired. And Brian confirmed with me that, yeah, they were never, ever able to put the 2 of them in the same room. You know, I mean, it was just one of those insane theories. During the investigation, so with that, during the investigation, I do know from my sources that when they searched David Mack's house, when the Bureau went in, they had these new cameras. So what they did is they cranked the heat in the house up to like 120 degrees, as hot as they can get it. And they had these thermal cameras so they could look inside the walls, because David Mack had done a bunch of work on his home and they believed that the money had been shoved into the drywall. So they were able to sort of look through the walls. But while they were there, they went through every wall in the house. And in the garage, they found, I forget what year it was, a black Caprice Super Sport, blacked out windows, 3 pounds of dust on it, 4 flat tires. It hadn't moved in I couldn't tell you how many years. And that sort of initiated the suspicion that David Mack may have been, if nothing else, his car may have been involved in the Biggie Smalls shooting.
Right. Because that was the car that was identified.
Correct.
That type of car was identified by
as the
by
shooter
witnesses.
and leaving the scene. Correct.
Right. And a lot of this played out in the movie City of Lies. I don't know if you saw it recently.
No.
Johnny Depp starred. He played Russell Poole in the film. And essentially what...
You know that Russell Poole died at the sheriff's department?
Yeah. He had a heart attack.
Yeah. He was there trying to roll over, thinking he had some information on Suge Knight. And since at the time I was working with Tom Mesereau, who was representing Suge Knight, information was turned over to us about that episode. And I'm sure I didn't know him personally. I'm sure he was probably a very nice person, but clearly he was wrong.
Right. Well, the movie City of Lies basically implied that the LAPD knew of some sort of connection between police officers and the Biggie murder, but because the lawsuit from Biggie's mother was so massive, it was essentially $1 billion lawsuit when you look at the lifetime earnings of a superstar like Biggie, that they try to bury it because they couldn't withstand a lawsuit that big. Is that total nonsense, or do you think there's some legs with that?
That's a Russell Poole conspiracy theory.
Right.
I am, again, not a conspiracy theorist. I am not friends with Jesse Ventura. The reason I say that is obviously he had a show called Conspiracy Theory. Okay. But that was Russell all the way. Russell, in his book, which I only read a portion of, I couldn't stomach it. The bottom line is everything was a conspiracy. And I don't really buy into that. I don't think that people are that organized. Again, the majority of police officers that I know, whether I have a good or bad relationship, the most important thing to them, in theory, would be their children, but it's not. It's their pension. And these people are not going to jeopardize their pension so they can retire at 55 and live like royalty the rest of their lives doing whatever over some nonsensical cover-up. Why would you do that? You know, there are checks and balances. There are other cops that would roll over on you like a hunchback doing somersaults. So what's the point of trying to pretend or protect somebody? For what? What are you going to gain from it? I don't buy it. Sorry.